You're nothing but a washed-up has-been who can't accept that your time is over." The words exploded from Shawn Michaels' mouth like a verbal sledgehammer, shattering the backstage calm at Madison Square Garden. Hulk Hogan stood frozen, his trademark confidence cracking for the first time in decades. What happened in the next 8 seconds would create the most bitter rivalry in wrestling history. March 18, 2005. Madison Square Garden, New York City. The backstage area was buzzing with excitement following an incredible Friday night SmackDown taping. But in the talent lounge, away from the cameras and crowds, a confrontation was brewing that would expose years of buried resentment and professional jealousy. Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid, Mr. WrestleMania himself, sat in a corner reviewing his match notes. At 39 years old, HBK was in the midst of one of wrestling's greatest comeback stories. After a 4-year retirement due to a career-threatening back injury, Shawn had returned to WWE in 2002 and was having some of the best matches of his life. But something was eating at Shawn. Something that had been building since Hulk Hogan's return to WWE 3 years earlier. The problem wasn't Hogan's wrestling ability or his drawing power. The problem was what Shawn saw as Hogan's refusal to acknowledge the changing landscape of professional wrestling. Earlier that evening, Shawn had overheard a conversation between Hogan and several WWE executives about upcoming storylines and match possibilities. Hogan had been discussing potential opponents and feuds with his usual confidence, but his comments had revealed an attitude that Shawn found infuriating. "These young guys today don't understand what it takes to be a real superstar," Hogan had said, his voice carrying that familiar theatrical boom. "They've got technical skills, sure, but they don't have the charisma, the connection with the audience, the larger-than-life personality that makes someone truly special. Wrestling today is too focused on athleticism and not enough on entertainment." Those words hit Shawn like a physical blow. Here was Hulk Hogan, a man who had been wrestling essentially the same 5 moves for 20 years, dismissing the current generation of wrestlers as inferior entertainers. Shawn, who had spent his career perfecting his craft and putting on 5-star classics, was being lumped in with young guys who supposedly didn't understand entertainment. The final straw came when Hogan added, "I mean, look at some of these so-called main eventers. They can wrestle, but do they have that special something that makes people want to buy a ticket? Do they have that magic that turns wrestling into something bigger than sports entertainment?" Shawn knew Hogan wasn't talking about him directly, but the implication was clear. In Hogan's mind, the current generation of wrestlers, including Shawn Michaels, were technically proficient but lacking in the intangible qualities that made true superstars. This attitude represented everything Shawn despised about wrestling politics. The idea that past success automatically qualified someone to judge current performers. The assumption that entertainment value could only be measured by Hogan's era standards. The dismissive attitude toward wrestlers who had evolved the business beyond basic storytelling and limited move sets. Shawn approached Hogan with the purposeful stride of a man who had reached his breaking point. His usual cocky swagger was replaced by something more dangerous, controlled fury mixed with years of accumulated frustration. "Hulk," Shawn said, his voice carrying the edge that made smart wrestlers nervous. "I need to talk to you." Hogan turned with his practiced smile, the expression of someone accustomed to being approached by fellow wrestlers, seeking advice or approval. "Hey Shawn. Great match tonight, brother. You really know how to work a crowd." The condescending tone in Hogan's voice, the subtle implication that he was complimenting Shawn on basic wrestling fundamentals, pushed Shawn past his carefully maintained professional composure. "Cut the bullshit, Hulk," Shawn said quietly, but loud enough for nearby wrestlers to take notice. "I heard what you said about this generation not understanding entertainment, about us not having that special something that makes real superstars." Hogan's smile faltered slightly. He had been in the wrestling business long enough to recognize when a conversation was about to turn confrontational. Shawn, I think there might be some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Shawn interrupted, stepping closer. You think we don't understand entertainment? You think we don't have that magic? Let me tell you something about magic, Hulk. Magic is making people believe that a 5'11" guy from San Antonio can be the best wrestler in the world. Magic is stealing the show at WrestleMania 5 times while you were making movies and playing bass guitar. The backstage area had gone quiet. Wrestlers who had been relaxing after the show were now watching with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a car accident. This wasn't typical wrestling business. This was personal, and it was getting ugly fast. Hogan raised his hands in what was meant to be a calming gesture. Shawn, brother, I respect what you've accomplished. You're a great technical wrestler. One of the best I've ever seen. If I said something that came across as dismissive, that wasn't my intention. Technical wrestler. Shawn's voice rose sharply, carrying the sting of someone whose entire career had just been reduced to a single dimension. Is that what you think I am? Just some guy who knows how to do wrestling moves? Shawn's fists clenched at his sides, not in preparation for a physical fight, but from the sheer effort of containing years of frustration with wrestling's old guard mentality. You want to talk about entertainment, Hulk? Let's talk about entertainment. You've been doing the same entrance, the same poses, the same 5 moves, and the same finish for 25 years. You call that entertainment? I call that coasting on past success. The accusation hit its mark. Hogan's face flushed red, not with embarrassment, but with genuine anger. His hands, which had been raised in a peaceful gesture, now clenched into fists that looked like they could crush bones. Shawn, Hogan said, his voice carrying a warning tone that few wrestlers had ever heard. You need to be very careful about what you're saying here. I've earned my place in this business. I've drawn more money, sold more tickets, and entertained more people than anyone in wrestling history. Past tense. Hulk. Past tense. Shawn shot back. You've spent the last 10 years living off accomplishments from the 1980s while guys like me have been carrying this company on our backs. You want to know what real entertainment looks like? Watch my match with Kurt Angle at WrestleMania 21. Watch me and Chris Jericho tear the house down. Watch me put on 5-star classics while you're collecting paychecks for nostalgia appearances. The personal nature of Shawn's attack was escalating beyond typical backstage disagreements. This was character assassination, delivered with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly how to cut deepest. You know what your problem is, Hulk? Shawn continued, his voice now loud enough to be heard throughout the backstage area. You can't stand the fact that wrestling evolved beyond you. You can't accept that there are wrestlers today who are better than you ever were. More athletic, more skilled, more entertaining, and most importantly, more relevant. Hogan stood perfectly still for exactly 8 seconds, his expression cycling through surprise, hurt, anger, and finally a cold determination that anyone who knew him well would recognize as dangerous. During those 8 seconds, the entire backstage area held its breath, waiting to see how the most successful wrestler in history would respond to being called irrelevant by one of his supposed peers. When Hogan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have conveyed. Every word was precisely chosen, delivered with the kind of controlled intensity that comes from decades of dealing with challenges both inside and outside the wrestling ring. Shawn, Hogan said, never breaking eye contact. You're right about one thing. Wrestling has evolved. The athleticism is incredible. The technical skills are off the charts. The matches are more complex than they've ever been. Hogan's voice grew slightly stronger, but remained controlled and utterly convincing in its sincerity. But you're wrong about everything else. Dead wrong. And the fact that you can't see it proves that for all your talent, you still don't understand what this business is really about. The silence that followed was deafening. Shawn Michaels stared at Hulk Hogan, clearly not expecting this measured response to his emotional outburst. This business isn't about who can do the most moves or who can have the most technical 5-star matches, Hogan continued. This business is about connecting with people. It's about making them care. It's about creating moments that they remember for the rest of their lives. Hogan gestured around the backstage area where dozens of wrestlers and crew members were watching this unprecedented confrontation. You talk about relevance? I've been relevant for 30 years because I understand something you don't. Wrestling isn't about impressing other wrestlers. It's about touching the hearts of people who don't know the difference between a suplex and a body slam, but know the difference between someone who cares about them and someone who's just showing off. The power had shifted in the conversation. Hogan was now the one delivering the education, and Shawn was the one being forced to listen. You want to compare accomplishments? Hogan asked. Fine, let's compare. But let's not just talk about match ratings from wrestling magazines. Let's talk about the kids who became wrestling fans because they saw Hulk Hogan overcome impossible odds. Let's talk about the parents who brought their families to wrestling shows because they trusted Hulk Hogan to give them something wholesome and inspiring. Hogan stepped closer to Shawn. Close enough that only Shawn could hear his next words clearly. You're one of the most talented wrestlers I've ever seen, Shawn. Maybe the most talented. But talent without humility is just showing off. And right now, you're showing off. The words, "You're nothing but a washed-up has-been, who can't accept that your time is over," were still echoing in the air. But now they seemed petty and juvenile compared to Hogan's measured response. My time isn't over, Shawn, Hogan said, his voice returning to normal volume. It's different, but it's not over. And your time is just beginning if you can learn to use your incredible gifts to lift people up instead of tearing them down. Shawn stood there, his anger deflated, replaced by something much more complex. He had come into this confrontation expecting to humiliate Hogan, to expose him as an outdated relic clinging to past glory. Instead, he had been given a master class in grace under pressure and the difference between talent and wisdom. The backstage area remained silent for several more seconds as both men processed what had just happened. Finally, Shawn spoke, his voice much quieter now, almost vulnerable. You think I'm just showing off? He asked. I think you're incredibly gifted, Hogan replied. I think you're passionate about this business. I think you care about being the best, but I also think you're so focused on proving how good you are that you sometimes forget why being good matters. Shawn considered this, and for the first time since his return from injury, he looked genuinely uncertain about something. So what do you think I should do? Stop trying to prove you're better than everyone else, Hogan said simply. Start trying to make everyone else better. Use your talent to elevate the people around you. Show the world that wrestling can be both athletic and entertaining, both technical and emotional. The conversation that followed lasted another 20 minutes, with the initial confrontation evolving into something resembling mentorship. Hogan shared insights about connecting with audiences, while Shawn talked about the technical aspects of modern wrestling that Hogan admitted he didn't fully understand. By the end, what had started as a bitter confrontation had become a mutual recognition of different approaches to the same goal: entertaining people through professional wrestling. I owe you an apology, Shawn said as their conversation wound down. What I said about you being washed up was out of line. You're not washed up, you're just different from what I expected. Hogan extended his hand, and they shook with what appeared to be genuine respect. And you're exactly what I expected, Shawn. Passionate, talented, and unwilling to settle for anything less than excellence. Those are good qualities, even when they make you difficult to work with. The impact of their confrontation was felt immediately throughout WWE. Other wrestlers who had witnessed the exchange began sharing the story, and soon it became legendary within the industry. not because of the insults or the anger, but because of how it ended, with two very different wrestlers finding common ground, despite their philosophical differences. Years later, when wrestling historians looked back on the period when WWE successfully bridged the gap between old-school entertainment and modern athleticism, many pointed to this backstage confrontation as a catalyst. Shawn's challenge to Hogan's relevance had forced both men to articulate what they valued most about professional wrestling, and their eventual understanding had helped create a template for respecting both tradition and innovation. Shawn Michaels would go on to have some of the greatest matches of his career in the years following this conversation, but with a new awareness of his responsibility to make wrestling meaningful for audiences, not just impressive for critics. Hulk Hogan would begin incorporating more modern elements into his performances while maintaining the emotional connection that had made him legendary. The phrase, "You're nothing but a washed-up has-been," became a reminder within WWE that confrontation could lead to growth if both parties were willing to listen as well as speak. 8 seconds of silence had transformed a potential feud into an opportunity for mutual education and respect. The ripple effects of their confrontation extended far beyond that single backstage encounter. Within days, word of the exchange had spread throughout the wrestling industry, with different versions of the story emerging depending on who was telling it. Some wrestlers focused on Shawn's initial attack, viewing it as long overdue honesty about wrestling's old guard clinging to relevance. Others emphasized Hogan's measured response, seeing it as proof that experience and wisdom could overcome youthful arrogance and technical superiority. WWE management initially worried that the confrontation might create lasting animosity between two of their biggest stars, but they soon realized that the opposite had happened. The honest exchange had actually improved the working relationship between Shawn and Hulk, creating mutual respect where there had previously been professional distance. Wrestling journalists who learned about the incident struggled with how to report it. The story had elements of great wrestling drama, ego clashes, generational differences, heated exchanges, but the mature resolution defied typical wrestling coverage. The incident influenced how WWE approached storylines involving veterans and current stars. Creative teams began developing stories showing how different wrestling philosophies could complement each other rather than compete. Shawn Michaels incorporated lessons from the confrontation into his work, focusing on emotional storytelling alongside technical excellence. His matches gained deeper resonance as he balanced athleticism with heart-centered performances. The confrontation proved that wrestling's most valuable moments sometimes happened away from cameras, where real people found ways to bridge differences through honest communication and mutual respect.